It's the, good morning. First and foremost, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming, both here in person as well as those of you that may be joining us via live streaming. My name is Nate Stutz. I'm the superintendent here at Perry Local School District. Joining me this morning is Mr. Jeff Bartholomew, our treasurer. Also in the crowd is Mr. Leone, our assistant superintendent, and Mr. Wolf, our director of business operations. Basically, the way this will look is we're going to go through the presentation. For those of you that are present here live, you have been given a note card with a pen. If you have questions, please, by all means, write those questions down. And at the end of the presentation, we'll provide an opportunity for those questions to be addressed. For those of you that are streaming live, as you have questions, please just send them to us via the streaming. And same thing at the end of the presentation, we'll take some time to, provide an opportunity to address some of those questions. More or less, the whole purpose of wanting to meet with the community here a number of times this early winter, I guess, is just to provide kind of an introductory view of what's brought us to this point in terms of having conversations about an operating levy. With respect to the questions that may arise based upon the presentation and considerations you may have, please know we'll do our best to answer them. And if we don't have the answer for you at the moment, we'll certainly try to find them and get back with you. All in all, the overall purpose is just to provide information kind of regarding our story. A number of the things that we'll look at involve just the long-term planning of the district, as well as we'll take a look kind of at our financial history and the story of how we got to this point, as well as lastly, we'll look at fiscal responsibility of the district, just trying to outline some of the aspects of our story that demonstrates the importance of fiscal responsibility and stewardship. We'll also, obviously, it provides an opportunity to engage in feedback with the community. You have an opportunity to express your concerns and questions, and then it also provides us with the opportunity and kind of establish some means of providing some answers and responses to some of those questions and concerns. As already mentioned, the three things we'll be kind of looking at involve the long-term planning. In this portion of the long-term planning representing what amounts to phase 2 of the process. We'll look at our financial history, which I mentioned, as well as the fiscal responsibility of the district. The three phases of the long-term planning involve the first phase was the bond issue. The second phase would be where we're presently at, the operating levy, and the third phase would be the renewal levy that will be coming up. So we're going to jump into that first. The bond levy was approved in May of 2020. And it is for the construction of new facilities for the district. Where we're presently at is having conversations about a potential operating levy. And one of the things upon the recommendation occurring in 2019, particularly November of 2019, the recommendation from the Building Advisory Committee to pursue the bond issue first, the imminent need for operating monies was also communicated at that time. We knew then that this was going to be a fairly imminent need in the near future. We didn't make any, we didn't hide the fact. We made no secret of that. We communicated it openly. The thought at that time was we were probably, a couple years away. At this time, looking forward to when the issue will be on the ballot in May of 23, we were able to push it out through some funding and some decisions that we've made through what amounts to about 3 years. One of the things that's come up, one of the questions, and this is the part I don't have the answer for, and it's probably one of the questions that's most paramount for a lot of people, is they always ask and want to know about the millage and the amount. Presently, I do not have that answer for you, and part of the reason being we wanted to make sure whatever recommendation was made to the board for a particular millage and amount was based on the most recent 5-year forecast. We wanted to have the most up-to-date numbers to base that decision upon. We just submitted and had approved our most recent 5-year Thursday night at our last board meeting. So the next steps for us involve sitting down and looking at what exactly is our need and making a recommendation to the board, engaging with the board in dialogue. Part of wanting to have these meetings, even prior to having that millage and the amount, was also trying to open up dialogue between us and community members, providing people an opportunity to share their thoughts, provide questions. But that's one of the pieces with respect to this operating levy that presently we don't have. The intention will be sometime here in December or January to make that recommendation to the board. And at that time, obviously, I mean, it will be communicated frequently and often. The last part of our long-term plan involves the renewal levy. Ultimately, our goal with these levies, with respect to the operating and the renewal, the two phases that we're in and going to be moving into, ultimately our goal is to approve the new monies first and then the renewal second, both as separate issues. If necessary, we may be in a position where we would be forced to combine them, similar to what was done in 1996. So going back, this renewal levy essentially was passed in 1996. As a part of that renewal, there were two parts. There was a renewal that was worth 9.4 mils and new monies at 9.5 mils. For a total of 18.9. And basically since that time, it's been renewed every 5 years. The millage at the time of passage was 18.9, and presently the effective millage is only 9.8 mils. With respect to the millage that it was passed at compared to what the effective millage is, basically when a levy is approved, you cannot, beyond that, you can't collect any more money successively for that levy than you did when it was passed. So we're collecting the same amount of money today that we collected on it in 1996. What happens though is it was 18.9 mils at the time we passed it. As property valuations in a community increase, it drives your effective millage down. So whereby in 1996, we collected, so this 18.9 mils was for $8 million. In 1996, we collected $8 million. In 2022, we're collecting $8 million. The dollar amount does not change, but what happens is, by virtue of your property valuations increasing, it does drive the millage down. So 26 years ago, it took 18.9 mils to collect that 8 million. Today, it only takes 9.8 to collect that 8 million. But once again, the goal for us is at this time to pass the operating first and then pursue the renewal second, both as separate issues. Once again, if circumstances necessitate, we could potentially look at combining them into a very similar levy as the one that was passed in 1996. But our hope and goal is to be able to do so separately. Later in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about the timeline of the bond levy and the operating levy, as well as some of the financial implications. The next piece to this is just wanting to make sure that we're clear on different levies can be used for different things. The first type of levy I'd like to bring your attention to is the bond levy. They can be used for construction purposes, facilities, renovations, remodeling. One thing that we should have included here is also land acquisition for the purpose of construction. One of the things that is available for districts to take advantage of with respect to bond issues is that you can partner with the state of Ohio for matching funds, which is actually something we are doing. We are partnering with the state of Ohio, the OFCC, for the purpose of building our new facilities. With respect to the debt that arises for a district with the sale of bonds and the interest rates of those bonds, generally speaking, they're paid off over a time period of between like 20 and 35, 36 years. The operating levy that we're discussing right now is for just that. It's for day-to-day operations. Looking at like salaries, benefits, classroom materials, you name it. Anything that deals with the day-to-day operations typically is paid for by monies generated through operating levies. They aren't generally used for the purposes of addressing like building, like construction needs and so forth. You could, but generally they are not. The single most important thing I want to drive home with respect to a bond issue, however, is bond monies cannot be used for operating expenses. So one of the questions that's arisen and we continue to field is we passed a levy in 2020. It was a bond issue. Why can't we just use that money to address our operating needs? Because it's illegal. Like, you can't. When you pass a bond issue, those monies are designated for the purposes of construction, like I said, remodeling, renovations, land acquisition, and so forth. So you technically cannot use that money for the purpose of operating on a day-to-day basis. Last thing, the renewal levy. Basically, just talked a little bit about this a second ago. You can renew it, every so often once it expires. In our case, it's every 5 years. It has to be used for the same purpose, and when you renew it, it's always at the effective millage. So going back, like I said, it was approved in '96 at 18.9 mils. When we do renew it, it will be at the effective millage at that time. Presently, it's right around 9.8. Next thing we're going to look at is just the kind of financial history and timeline that have brought us to this point. Going the whole way back, starting with 1996 when we passed new operating monies. Talked a little bit about it. 8.9 mil levy passed in 1996, 9.4 renewal plus 9.5 new. This was the last time our school district passed new monies for the purpose of operating. We've renewed it basically every 5 years since that time. Fast forward to July of 2006, about 10 years later, the state of Ohio, through legislation, began the phasing out of what is known as the tangible personal property tax for schools. And basically what that was, it was a tax on, it was a business tax on like inventory and equipment. And considering, a lot of the industry and some of the businesses we have in our district, there was a significant tax for us, significant source of revenue. And in phasing it out, it went from, at that time, it was collecting about $4.5 million annually, and over the next 15 years, it was completely phased out. I think our last installment was in 2021, and as of this year, 2022, we collected nothing for that. In 2010, in July of 2010, our cash balance was an all-time high in the district. And then the following year, in 2011, we began deficit spending for the first time as a result of that loss of tangible personal property tax. The decision at that time was to continue with our present programming and also wanting to remain competitive with respect to retaining our present staffing and employees, as well as also like trying to attract, new staff as well. In July of 2015, we saw an increase in state funding, and at that time, we were no longer in deficit spending. Mr. Bartholomew?
Yeah, just to clarify a little bit about what Mr. Stutz is talking about as far as deficit spending. Deficit spending is when you spend more than you receive for that fiscal year. So we were able to do that for those years mentioned, which was 2011 through 2015, because of that record high cash balance. But obviously, if you continue to deficit spend or spend more than you receive, you're going to run out of money at some point in time. And the board at that time realized that. We knew what situation that we were in. We chose to continue to keep the level of programming as is at that time, with the thoughts then, and Mr. Stutz will get into this a little bit as well, really focusing in on when folks retire, when they resign, looking to see if we, cannot replace that person, just to start, saving money as far as salaries and expenditures go. The other thing I wanted to mention real quick, we talked about the loss of $4.5 million in the tangible personal property tax. Just to kind of give you an idea of what that means, right now our district collects about $50 million in operating revenue, and that is made up of mainly of state funding and real estate taxes. So at that point in time, $4.5 million was a very significant loss for the district. So just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. So moving on, in July of 2017, district, made the decision to invest heavily in providing our students with the technology to prepare them. I don't think I have to tell anybody here, regardless of what your profession is, what content area you study in, subject matter, all of us process our work through technology. So in terms of trying to prepare, our students for, what lies ahead and the life outside of, Perry local school system, we felt it was extremely important to take this step, obviously at a cost. In July of 2018, the district was engaged in negotiations, and through those negotiations, settled upon offering health insurance to our classified staff at 30 hours per week. So before I get too far, generally speaking in schools, we have two groups of employees. We have certified employees, we have classified employees. Certified employees would be those requiring certificates or licenses in order to work. Administrators, teachers, guidance counselors, school psychologists, speech, language pathologists. I could go on. They're just to name a few. Classified are those positions that do not require licenses or certificates to be employed. Secretaries, custodial maintenance, food service workers, just to name a few. We were the last district in our area to offer our classified people health benefits at 30 hours. We basically required them to be employed at 35 hours before we would offer health benefits. And through the negotiations, the decision was made to phase in basically offering those benefits at 30 hours from 35. And the big piece to it was, once again, trying to remain competitive with respect to retaining our staff, but also attracting new staff. And there was also a piece to it where we just felt at that time it was the right thing to do by our people. So we made the decision to make that, agreement and compromise. And once again, obviously it came at a cost. Deficit spending returns through 2020. Fast forward to November of 2019, the Building Advisory Committee made the recommendation to the board to pursue the bond issue first and the operating levy second. So one of the questions that's come up frequently is, why did we pursue the bond issue first as opposed to the operating? And I can tell you, the Building Advisory Committee vetted this very question. I mean, we talked about, do we pursue a bond issue first, operating second? Do we pursue an operating first, bond second? Do we combine them in one issue? And having those conversations, considering there was a need for facilities and we had the opportunity to partner with the state, the driving factor in making the decision to pursue the bond issue first was wanting to lock in our state share. So going back a couple of slides, where it talks about with a bond levy, like I said, you're eligible when you look to pursue bond issues for construction purposes. So you do have the ability at times to partner with the state for funding. The driving factor in putting the bond issue on the ballot in 2020, doing it prior to the operating, was we wanted to lock in our state share. So our state share at that time was 62%. Your state share is directly linked to your property valuation. At that time, we had reason to believe, we started to see that we had reason to believe that our property valuations were going to start to increase. And as your property valuations increase, your state share decreases. It correspondingly, is reduced. So the biggest consideration when recommending to pursue the bond issue first was just that. We wanted to ensure that we were eligible for the greatest amount of matching funds we could be eligible for. And considering we thought our property valuations were going to increase, the decision was made to pursue the bond issue first. And I'll talk a little bit more here in a bit about the implications of that financially for the district here in a moment. In May of 2020, the bond issue passed, and as I don't have to explain to anybody here, this was the same spring that the pandemic impacted us all, and unfortunately, as a result of that, we experienced some reduction in state funding at that time. They took some funding away from us, and as a result, as you can see in July of 2020, our 5-year forecast predicted that we would be in the red in fiscal year 23. At that time, we started having some internal discussions about an operating levy. But at that time, it didn't proceed any further. In January of 2021, based upon being in the red in that fiscal year of 2023, we were going to be required to submit a plan to the state of Ohio, kind of indicating, basically showing how we're going to get out of it, more or less. Fortunately, shortly thereafter, in February 2021, that funding that was taken away from us by the state was returned. We were made whole, which impacted our 5-year, in addition to some other funding that was available at that time. Mr. Bartholomew?
I would like to point out as well, during this time, we keep talking about our 5-year forecast. By law, we are required to file a 5-year forecast every year, and that is usually done in the month of November. We do an update in May. So going back at this time, the 5-year forecast, we were negative, as Mr. Stutz mentioned, in year 3. Whenever that happens in the state of Ohio, that's when the state comes in and says, okay, guys, you've got to do something here soon. What's your plan so you don't run out of money here, obviously, in the next year or so? To be clear, we were in the district's 5-year forecast. This was the only time since I've been here, since 2013, that we have been in the red or in the negative in the 3rd year of the forecast. So you're going to talk about the COVID funding and everything. You want to go through that, or you want me to jump in?
Stay where you are. So in 2021, then shortly thereafter, we received some additional ESSER fundings, and basically more or less enabled us to push out our positive balance through fiscal year of 2025. And I'll let Mr. Bartholomew talk about the ESSER funds.
Yeah, so we talk about ESSER funds. These are the federal COVID funds that were distributed back in that time. And just to let everybody know, we received we received about $8 million in total. We were able to use about $6 million of that to go back and credit our general fund for salaries that were paid during our shutdown. And if you remember, our shutdown was March of 2020 through the end of that school year. So we were able to credit ourselves back $6 million, which then that was our response basically to the state. Once we plugged that back into the forecast, we were okay, air quotes again. So we no longer had to report to the state. And as far as the forecasts go, when at that time we were able to push that back out, as Mr. Stutz mentioned.
Thank you. And with the ESSER monies, by and large, all of it, with the exception of a portion that we had to designate to what the state calls learning loss, all of it was used to basically supplant some of our expenses for personnel at that time, which helped us push out the 5-year forecast. Last thing, most recently in July of 2022, the new state funding formula essentially is found to not come at a significant benefit to us as a district. In fact, no benefit. We're flat funded according to this formula at this time. We show a positive balance through fiscal year 2025. And once again, we're in a position where here we are, we're discussing an operating levy. The one thing I want to talk about with respect to this Fair School Funding Plan, this new funding formula is a part of a plan referred to as the Fair School Funding Plan. They have been working on this collaboratively at the state level, legislators, administrators, treasurers. They've been collaborating on this for years. I want to say the first publication that kind of laid out the components of the plan that I saw was in the spring of 2019, I think March or April. Initially, the intent, the hope was that as they developed this plan, there was, and I will tell you, based upon the collaborative efforts, there was a lot of support for this at that time. The idea was they were hoping that it would be memorialized by law through legislation. It would become law and the state would have to use it. Fast forward to more recently, you've started to see some opposition to the plan and the use of the formula, and basically what they settled upon, as opposed to memorializing it in law, they're just implementing it through the biennial budgeting process that the state uses to determine where funding goes. At that time, the intention is to supposedly phase the plan in, over 6 years. Where we're at presently is we're in the midst of that partial funding. All indications at this point is that they're going to continue to do just that, partially fund it. However, I will tell you, if it were fully funded, it would be to our benefit on the order of about an additional $3.37 million a year, which I don't have to tell you, that's significant. But at this time, we cannot count on that. Like I said, all indications are that it's going to remain partially funded, and for us, that basically means flat funded. Next thing we'll look at is fiscal responsibility. So first piece, just long-term planning, and this goes back to the Building Advisory Committee making the recommendation to the board to pursue the bond issue first. I'm going to talk about two things here, and both of these go back to the question that I shared has come up numerous times regarding why did we pursue the bond issue first compared to the operating. And the question in nature is one of hindsight, and I guess the responses I'm going to give are one of hindsight, but I feel it's important, it's incumbent upon us, with retrospective questions to provide retrospective answers. The first thing I'm going to mention, I do feel that as a district we can take some credit for, because it's tied to the decision to pursue the bond issue first. And I already talked a little bit about locking our state share in. Essentially, at that time, it was 62%. Our concern was we felt our valuations were going to increase. That's driving our state share down. So we pursued the bond issue first, and we locked that 62% in. Presently, if let's say hypothetically we would have pursued the operating levy in 2020, and we would be talking about pursuing the bond issue in the spring of 2023, our state share would be 54%. On a project the size of ours, that's significant. And if you put a dollar amount to it, essentially, had we waited to pursue the bond issue at this time, it would have come at a loss to the district of about $10.5 million. So I think in that regards, hindsight's favorable to us. This other piece I'm going to mention, we can't really take credit for. We knew at the time that we were looking to pass the bond issue that the interest rates were favorable. Like they were very favorable at that time for selling bonds at an interest rate. So essentially when you, just a very elementary level explanation, when you put a bond issue on the ballot for construction purposes, you're basically giving the rights to sell bonds at an interest rate at which basically then as a community you have to repay. So we sold the bonds at a low interest rate. Fast forward to today. Hypothetically, once again, let's say we were to pursue the operating levy first, the bond issue now, the cost to the district of trying to borrow the same amount of money today that we did in 2020 would include an additional $41 million. So once again, hindsight, none of us could have anticipated the interest rates were going to increase the way they have. But when you take into consideration the long-term planning and the decision at that time for the first phase of that planning to pursue the bond issue first, through locking in our state share at 62%, through selling the bonds at that time at a lower interest rate, the savings to the district is just under like $52 million, which I don't have to explain to anybody. That's significant. Efficient use of resources. Obviously, a big piece is this is the first time that we'll be coming back to the community in 26 years for new operating monies, which is a long time. And, yet with that being said, we've still, been able to provide, fantastic programming, services to our students at a very, very high level. And, our hope is to continue to do so as we move into the future. Next thing, we have listed there is just reductions of certified staff. Basically, over the last 5 years, since the start of 2018-19, we have realized a reduction of about 13 positions at a savings over those 5 years of about $3.35 million. As a part of those 13 positions, in the last 2 years, since the start of the 21-22 school year, we've reduced essentially 4 administrative central office positions. The one thing, I will tell you, these reductions, by and large, we realized because of need. I will tell you, regardless of what financial situation we're in, the first question you should always ask is, when people resign or retire, is there a need to fill the position? And that's where we start. That's one of the first questions we ask is there a need to fill this position? And if there's not, in terms of being good stewards of the resources provided, that's something we have to look at. One of the things that also I'd like to speak to is, the district, we requested a performance audit from the state of Ohio in the spring of 2021. It's public record, and I know people have access to it. One of the questions that we frequently field or questions involve the performance audit. The first thing I want to make abundantly clear to everybody is we requested the audit. It wasn't forced upon us. We requested it for the simple reason we wanted to know where our staffing levels were at compared to our peers. And the way they set it up is they basically choose 10 peers. The peers are based on enrollment, socioeconomic status, amongst other things, but those are two of the big ones. And they just compare your staffing to theirs per 1,000 students. We found areas through the audit where staffing-wise we're pretty good. We found areas through the audit where we're not, we're less so. And we've already started to make some adjustments and decisions based upon some of the findings of that audit. And, my promise to you is we'll continue to do so. We'll continue to look at some of those areas. The last item listed is just investment in staff. And this goes back to offering our classified employees health insurance at 30 hours per week. And sometimes the fiscally responsible thing to do, sometimes the right thing to do is to take care of your people. And that was a big part of the decision we made at that time. Next steps, obviously going to continue to engage and encourage the community members to reach out to us. I'll be sharing some emails here in a second that will offer you an opportunity to reach out to us with questions, concerns, your thoughts in general. And I will tell you, if I can impress upon you anything today, is I want to hear from you. I do. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Basically, and I kind of shared this, the idea now that we have the 5-year forecast finalized as of Thursday night is to try to determine, with respect to an amount that's necessary as well as millage. At that point, we'd make a recommendation to the board in December or January and send the amounts to the auditor's office, and they would basically certify what millage it is that we need, and we would get it approved by the board and start to communicate with, the community again. Essentially, then in the spring, you would be looking at the ballot issue. In the space in between making that presentation recommendation to the board and the ballot issue, we will continue to engage, provide opportunities to meet and discuss the matter and provide further information. With respect to providing questions, one place you can direct them is to an email that's perryfaq@perrylocal.org. Information will continue to be posted. There will be a landing page on our website for information related to this on the Perry Local website. You can also find information through our Facebook pages in Perry Local Schools, as well as upcoming Perryites. Last thing, with respect to reaching out more personally, you can reach out to me, nathan.stutz@perrylocal.org. I've shared this with during the other meetings as well. My official name's Nathan. I sign my name Nathan. I go by Nate. So if you see me on the streets, just please call me Nate. I reserve Nathan for my mother. Mr. Leone, our assistant superintendent, rich.leone@perrylocal.org, or Mr. Bartholomew, jeff.bartholomew@perrylocal.org. Please reach out to us. I go back to whether you send it to us directly or you send it and direct it to the Perry FAQ. Either way is fine, but please know we want to hear from you. And lastly, thank you. Do we have any questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody wants to support the school district. It's just, what's this going to cost me?
Yeah. So the question was basically, what's it going to cost me? And the question was kind of directed back to like the renewal at 9.8 mils. So I don't have that answer for you. And so the big thing is, like I said, our whole reason for holding off on that was more or less we wanted to make sure we had the most accurate 5-year forecast before we even made a recommendation of like, what do we need? You know as well as I do, like sometimes things financially end up being better than anticipated and sometimes less so. What I didn't want to do is come out with a millage without knowing really exactly where our most present financial situation stands. So we've held off. As soon as we have that information, it will be shared. That I promise. But I fully acknowledge, like that is one of the big questions. Yep.
So, if this does not pass, what is the district going to, what changes are we going to see?
So the question is, like, if this doesn't pass, like, what next, basically? In good faith, I mean, I share, we'll look at ways that we can reduce, some of our expenses. But I also want to be open and transparent. This isn't going away. The financial need is there, and essentially, like, we will continue to come back. The hard part with that is the longer you wait to collect, unfortunately, you end up having to ask for more. So, like I said, the financial need isn't going away. And like I said, in good faith, we will certainly look at ways that we can reduce some of our expenses. However, irregardless of cuts, this needs not, it's not going to go away. Like I said, we will continue to come back and ask for new monies. And, at some point, the hope would be that, the community would agree to, move forward with, approving it. But that's a very good question.
And one of the concerns is, a lot of program cuts you see at other districts, and it's usually the fine arts. That's a big concern here. I know we've got a huge group of students
Yep.
involved.
Yeah. So question centered around just in terms of making cuts and looking at some of our programs, specifically one mentioned regarding fine arts. So part of the reason I believe, as we've had conversations, we talked a little bit about the whole deficit spending piece, and Mr. Bartholomew, he is the longest tenured central office employee we have. He's been here since 2013, okay? So in 2011, we started into deficit spending. He joined in 2013. At that time, the board basically made the commitment. They said, you know what, we're in deficit spending, but we are going to continue to offer the programming to our students that they felt our students deserved at that time, knowing that at some point we're probably going to have to come back and ask for money. I think, and I can say since I've been here, that's pretty much been the position of the board as well. There are certain programs unique to our community and our district that make us who we are. And, with respect to wanting to continue to offer those programs, absolutely. The hard part is, like, when you look at, being in a position where you have to look at reducing expenses, it has to come from somewhere. My hope is, and my prayer is it doesn't come to that, because I know some of those programs are extremely significant here. And absolutely, you want to honor those programs that the community strongly values. The challenge in our role, my role, is like you have the educational side of it and you have the business side of making these decisions. And it's fantastic when the educational decisions, the business decisions all align. When sometimes they are in conflict with one another, it's tough. It's hard. So, no, I appreciate your question. Any others?
What do you need from us? Because there's such a small group. Are each of these that
So the big thing, good question. So the big thing is like our intention right now was just we just want to get this information out. This really isn't an advocacy meeting. I'm not here lobbying. I can't. There's just a certain level of that I can't get involved in. And that's where, the political action committee that we have, in terms of running like a levy campaign becomes more, that group will take on a very significant role. And I would tell you, if that's something you're interested in being a part of, I would please let me know and I will get you plugged in. We have some time in terms of, making, we have some time in terms of planning for that portion of preparing for the operating levy, but good question.
I'd like to add, excuse me, what you can do is if you come across folks who have questions or if they have opinions on facts that are different than what you heard today, please point them in our direction, because that's the biggest thing that we want to accomplish through all these meetings, is to make sure that everybody has the factual information needed then to make their decision when it comes time to vote. So that would be extremely helpful to us, is if you're talking to folks over the holidays and it doesn't seem like what you're hearing them say compared to what you heard today, point them in our direction and we would love to have a conversation with them.
Very good point, Jeff. And ultimately, whether you ultimately land on supporting, or not, I just want to make sure that we're all dealing in the facts. Whether you're against it, whether you're for it, you're dealing with truth. That is my biggest goal. That is the one thing I want to make sure everybody can base their decision on. This is where things stand. We frequently hear things that are just unfortunately factually not true. And that's probably one of the biggest pieces for us. But going back to the being involved, if interested with the levy committee or, actually helping with a campaign, please let me know. Any other questions? Mr. Leone? All righty. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, whether here in person or online via the streaming. Have a fantastic weekend and have a great Thanksgiving break. Thanks so much.